Welcome back, fellow explorers of the cosmos. You've found your way here, which means part of you is still curious, still wondering what lies beyond the horizon of everything we know. I'm glad you're here. This channel is a quiet place for big ideas, a place where science meets wonder, where the universe whispers its secrets to those willing to listen. So get comfortable, let your mind slow down, and let's explore the cosmos together, one extraordinary fact at a time. It was April 1st, 2026, just after midnight in Europe, when the world held its breath. From Launch Complex 39B at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, a rocket rose into the night sky unlike anything this generation had ever witnessed. A rocket carrying human beings to the moon. The last time humanity had dared such a thing was December 1972, Apollo 17. The world was a different place then. Now, more than 5 decades later, 4 humans burn once again into the darkness of space. Artemis II. The name sounds almost gentle for something so enormous. Artemis, goddess of the hunt and of the moon, returning to her celestial body. And with her, humanity returns to the place where we once stood in awe and then stopped dreaming. The engines ignite.
Reed, Victor, Christina, and Jeremy, good luck. Godspeed, Artemis II. Let's go.
The ground shakes, and slowly, impossibly slowly, the rocket climbs. Higher and higher, until the flames become a distant star, and the star disappears into the black. We are going back to the moon. 4 humans sat inside the Orion capsule as the engines fired. Commander Reed Wiseman, a calm and experienced NASA astronaut who had already spent months aboard the International Space Station. Pilot Victor Glover, the first African American to fly to the moon, a milestone that carries the weight of history in every single heartbeat. Mission Specialist Christina Cook, the first woman to travel to the moon, whose record-breaking stay on the ISS already proved what human endurance truly means. And Mission Specialist Jeremy Hansen, a Canadian astronaut representing not just his country, but an entire generation of people who grew up watching the stars and wondering. 4 people, 4 stories, 1 capsule, 1 moon. Together they form the most diverse crew ever to leave Earth's orbit. And together they carry the hopes of an entire planet with them into the dark. On April 6th, 2026, something happened that had not occurred since the dramatic near disaster of Apollo 13 in 1970. The Artemis II crew broke the record for the farthest distance any human being has ever traveled from Earth. At their peak, the 4 astronauts found themselves 252,756 miles from our planet. That is over 406,000 kilometers. To put that into perspective, if you drove a car without stopping, at highway speed, it would take you more than 270 years to cover that distance. The crew floated inside their capsule, looking out the window at a sight that fewer humans have seen than have climbed Mount Everest. The Earth, impossibly small. The moon, impossibly close. And all around them, the silent, infinite darkness of space. In that moment, they were the most isolated human beings in the history of our species. The rocket that carried Artemis II into space is called the Space Launch System, or SLS, and it is, by almost every measurement, the most powerful rocket ever to successfully launch humans into space. Its engines produce more thrust at liftoff than the legendary Saturn V that carried the Apollo astronauts to the moon, the very rocket that engineers of the 1960s called the greatest machine ever built by human hands. The SLS stands nearly 100 meters tall. It burns a staggering amount of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen in just the first few minutes of flight, releasing energy equivalent to dozens of nuclear power plants firing simultaneously. The ground trembles for miles around the launch pad. Windows rattle in buildings kilometers away. And yet, amid all that raw, almost incomprehensible power, 4 human beings sit calmly at the top, trusting in the work of thousands of engineers, technicians, and scientists who spent years making sure every single bolt, every sensor, every line of code was exactly right. Become home for 4 astronauts for nearly 10 days. Orion is the most advanced crewed spacecraft ever built. It was designed from the very beginning to go farther than any human spacecraft since Apollo, and navigation technology that simply did not exist 50 years ago. The crew module, where the astronauts live and work, is surprisingly compact, roughly the size of a large minivan. 4 people, living and sleeping and eating and conducting science in a space you could almost fit in your living room. And yet, every square centimeter of that space was designed with extraordinary care. The temperature is controlled. The air is recycled. The water is reclaimed. The systems are redundant. Because in space, there is no margin for error. One of the most remarkable things about Artemis II is something many people outside Europe may not know. The engine that powered the Orion spacecraft, the module that controlled propulsion, provided electricity, managed thermal regulation, and kept the crew alive in the vacuum of space, was not built in America. It was built in Europe. The European Service Module, constructed by Airbus Defence and Space and largely assembled in Bremen, Germany, represents the most significant contribution a non-American entity has ever made to a crewed lunar mission. For the first time in the history of human spaceflight, a non-American system transported astronauts toward the moon. The engineers in Bremen, who spent years designing and building this module, watched the launch in the middle of the night, and when the rocket cleared the tower, some of them wept. Because that was their work, writing a pillar of fire into history. Christina Koch became the first woman in human history to travel to the vicinity of the moon. Think about that for a moment. Since the very beginning of the space age, since Yuri Gagarin orbited Earth in 1961, since Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface in 1969, no woman had ever traveled beyond low Earth orbit. For 65 years, that frontier remained unbroken. Christina Koch broke it. She floated to the window of the Orion capsule and looked at the moon from a distance no woman had ever achieved. She had already broken records. She holds the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman, spending 328 days aboard the International Space Station. But this was different. This was the moon. And when future generations look back at the history of exploration, her name will be there, permanently, in the light of that ancient silver world. Victor Glover became the first African American to travel to the moon. The weight of that sentence is almost impossible to fully grasp. The history of the American space program is complex. For decades, extraordinarily talented black scientists, engineers, and pilots were excluded, overlooked, or forgotten. The hidden figures who calculated trajectories by hand. The test pilots who were passed over. The dreamers who were told the stars were not for them. Victor Glover flew to the moon for all of them. He sat in that capsule as pilot, one of the most technically demanding roles in any crewed mission, and he performed it with precision, with grace, and with the quiet understanding that he was not just making history for himself, but for every person who was ever told their dreams were too big. The first Canadian to the moon. Jeremy Hansen became the first Canadian and the first non-American to travel to the moon. Canada has been a partner in space exploration for decades, contributing the iconic Canadarm robotic systems to the Space Shuttle and the International Space Station. But no Canadian had ever left Earth orbit. Hansen changed that. He floated above the lunar surface and looked down at craters that were formed billions of years before any human being existed. He spoke about it with a quiet wonder that astronauts often carry, the sense that words cannot quite capture what the eyes are seeing. His presence on Artemis II was a signal to the world. The future of space exploration belongs not to one nation, but to all of humanity, working together, looking upward together, dreaming together. 10 days in space. The Artemis II mission lasted nearly 10 days from launch to splashdown, April 1st to April 10th, 2026. 10 days that changed everything. 10 days during which 4 human beings lived in the most extreme environment our species has ever voluntarily entered. They ate specially prepared food. They slept in restraints so they would not float away. They exercised to keep their muscles from weakening in zero gravity. They monitored hundreds of spacecraft systems. They conducted science experiments. They spoke to their families via radio delay. And every day, they looked out the window at a universe that most humans will only ever see in photographs. 10 days. Long enough to go to the moon and come back. Long enough to feel the silence of deep space settle into your bones. Long enough to never quite see the world the same way again. 8.8 million pounds of thrust. When the Space Launch System ignited its engines on April 1st, 2026, it produced over 8.8 million pounds of thrust. That number is almost impossible to visualize. Imagine the weight of roughly 40 fully loaded Boeing 747 jumbo jets, and then imagine that weight being pushed upward with enough force to escape Earth's gravity entirely. The sound alone was felt in the chest of every person standing within miles of the launch pad. The ground shook. The air vibrated. Birds fled from trees kilometers away. And at the top of that column of fire and smoke, 4 human beings sat strapped into their seats, feeling every single one of those millions of pounds pushing them upward, faster and faster, until the blue sky outside their windows faded to the deep, impossible black of space. In just a few minutes, they had left the world behind. The solid rocket boosters. As the SLS rocket climbed through Earth's atmosphere, 2 enormous solid rocket boosters burned alongside the main engines, providing additional thrust for the first 2 minutes of flight. These boosters are among the most powerful solid rocket motors ever flown. Once their fuel was exhausted, they were jettisoned, falling away from the rocket in a carefully choreographed sequence, tumbling back toward the ocean far below. After the boosters separated, the panels protecting the European service module were released, followed by the launch abort system, a tower sitting atop the capsule designed to pull the crew to safety in milliseconds if something went catastrophically wrong during ascent. Each separation was a small miracle of engineering timing, happening exactly as planned, exactly as thousands of hours of simulation had predicted. The launch abort system. Speaking of the launch abort system, let's take a moment to appreciate what it actually is. Sitting at the very top of the rocket, above the Orion capsule, was a tower equipped with powerful solid rocket motors, capable of pulling the crew module away from a failing rocket in under a second. If sensors had detected a catastrophic failure during ascent, this system would have fired automatically, yanking the capsule away from the explosion before any human could consciously react. The astronauts would have experienced a force of around 15 Gs, 15 times the force of gravity, for a brief, violent moment, before parachutes deployed and brought them safely to the ground or water. It is a remarkable piece of engineering, a system designed entirely to never be used, but built with absolute precision, just in case. 2 orbits around Earth first, before heading to the moon. Artemis II did not simply point itself at the lunar surface and fire its engines. Instead, the spacecraft and crew spent time orbiting Earth, circling our planet twice in an elliptical path that stretched from about 115 miles at its lowest point to over 44,000 miles at its highest. This was deliberate, Engineers wanted the crew to verify that every single system aboard Orion was functioning correctly while still relatively close to home. The life support systems, the communication systems, the navigation systems, all checked and double-checked in the harsh environment of space, but with Earth still visible out the window and emergency return still theoretically possible. It was patience built into the mission design, a deep breath before the leap. Manual piloting in space. One of the most fascinating early moments of the Artemis II mission was something called the Proximity Operations Demonstration. After separating from the upper stage of the rocket, the crew manually flew the Orion spacecraft, taking direct control of its trajectory and orientation, guiding it through space using hand controllers and their own judgment. This was not just a thrill for the astronauts. It was a critical test. Future Artemis missions will require the crew to manually dock with spacecraft in lunar orbit, a delicate, demanding operation where precision is everything. By practicing with the empty upper stage as a target, the crew generated real performance data that engineers on the ground use to refine procedures for the moon landings that will follow. In space, every maneuver is both science and art. Manual piloting in space. One of the most fascinating early moments of the Artemis II mission was something called the Proximity Operations Demonstration. After separating from the upper stage of the rocket, the crew manually flew the Orion spacecraft, taking direct control of its trajectory and orientation, guiding it through space using hand controllers and their own judgment. This was not just a thrill for the astronauts. It was a critical test. Future Artemis missions will require the crew to manually dock with spacecraft in lunar orbit, a delicate, demanding operation where precision is everything. By practicing with the empty upper stage as a target, the crew generated real performance data that engineers on the ground use to refine procedures for the moon landings that will follow. In space, every maneuver is both science and art. The translunar injection burn. On the second day of the mission, the most important engine firing of the entire journey took place. Called the translunar injection burn, this was the moment when Orion's main engine fired for the last time, pushing the spacecraft out of Earth's gravitational grip and onto a trajectory toward the moon. After this burn, there was no turning back in any simple sense. The spacecraft was committed to its path, following the invisible curves of gravity toward the lunar surface. What makes this burn particularly elegant is that it served a double purpose. Not only did it send Orion to the moon, but the same trajectory, the free return path, was designed so that if nothing else was done, gravity alone would eventually pull the spacecraft back to Earth. Nature itself became the safety net. The free return trajectory. The free return trajectory deserves its own moment of appreciation. It is a concept born from orbital mechanics, the mathematics of how objects move under the influence of gravity. By carefully calculating the angle and speed of the translunar injection burn, mission planners designed a path that looped around the moon and curved naturally back toward Earth, requiring no additional engine burns for the return journey. This is the same type of trajectory that saved the lives of the Apollo 13 crew in 1970, when an explosion crippled their spacecraft, and they used the moon's gravity to slingshot themselves home. For Artemis II, the free return path was not an emergency measure. It was the plan from the beginning. 4 days to the moon. After the translunar injection burn, the crew settled into the rhythm of deep space travel. For roughly 4 days, Orion drifted through the darkness between Earth and Moon, covering the distance at speeds that sound fast, tens of thousands of kilometers per hour, but feel almost imperceptibly slow against the vast scale of space. During this time, the astronauts monitored systems, conducted experiments, ate their carefully prepared meals, and slept in their seats. They spoke to their families. They recorded videos. They looked out the windows at a view that changed almost imperceptibly, the Earth shrinking slowly, the moon growing slowly, and all around them the stars, unchanged, unwavering, utterly indifferent to the remarkable thing happening in their midst. Entering the moon's sphere of influence. On the fifth day of the mission, the spacecraft crossed an invisible boundary that exists only in mathematics, the moon's sphere of influence, the point where the moon's gravitational pull becomes stronger than Earth's. From that moment forward, the crew was not falling toward home. They were falling toward the moon. This transition happens silently, with no sensation, no sound, no visible sign. Only the navigation computers know exactly when it occurs. But what it represents is profound. The moment when human beings become, in the most literal physical sense, lunar travelers. Captured by another world. Drawn toward a surface that humans last walked upon more than half a century ago. 30 to 50 minutes of silence. As Orion swept around the far side of the moon, something happened that is both technically routine and profoundly human. The crew lost all communication with Earth. For between 30 and 50 minutes, depending on the exact geometry of the flyby, there was complete radio silence. No voice from mission control, no telemetry flowing to the ground. 4 human beings, more isolated than any humans had been since Apollo, alone on the far side of the moon, with nothing but the hum of spacecraft systems and the ancient, crater-scarred surface scrolling past their windows below. During those silent minutes, they took photographs, they made observations, and they experienced something that almost no human being in history has ever felt. Total, absolute separation from Earth, the far side of the moon. The far side of the moon is one of the most alien landscapes in the solar system, and yet it has never been seen by human eyes from this close before Artemis II. Unlike the near side, which faces Earth and contains the dark volcanic plains we see from our backyards, the far side is almost entirely covered in ancient impact craters, densely packed and overlapping, scarred by billions of years of bombardment. There are no large dark plains, no familiar patterns, just a pale, battered, ancient surface stretching to every horizon. The crew of Artemis II photographed it through the windows of Orion, capturing images that scientists on the ground eagerly studied in the days that followed. Each photo was a data point. Each data point was a small piece of a very large puzzle. The record broken. On April 6th, 2026, at 7:07 in the evening Eastern Time, the Artemis II crew broke the record for the farthest distance any human being has ever traveled from Earth. The previous record had been held since 1970, set by the crew of Apollo 13 during their harrowing emergency return from the moon. For 56 years, no human had traveled farther from our planet. Then, quietly, mathematically, the Orion spacecraft crossed that invisible threshold at 248,655 miles and kept going. The crew reached a maximum distance of 252,756 miles, over 406,000 kilometers from Earth. In the grand scale of the universe, this is an infinitesimal distance. But in human terms, in the terms of what our fragile bodies have dared to do, it was the farthest any of us had ever gone. What Earth looks like from there. From a distance of 252,756 miles, the Earth does not look like a planet. It looks like a marble, a small, luminous sphere hanging in an absolute blackness, so total it seems almost solid. The crew could cover the entire Earth with their thumb held at arm's length. Every human being who has ever lived, every city ever built, every ocean ever sailed, reduced to something smaller than a fingernail. The astronauts described this view in different ways. Some used words like humbling. Some said peaceful. Some simply went quiet. There is a psychological phenomenon that astronauts and space scientists call the overview effect, a shift in perspective that occurs when a human being sees Earth from space and suddenly, viscerally understands its fragility and its preciousness. 4 people felt it from farther away than any humans in history. The moon as a basketball. At their closest approach to the moon, the crew of Artemis II saw something that no human had seen from this vantage point in over 50 years, the lunar surface filling a significant portion of their windows. NASA described it this way. From the distance of the flyby, the moon appeared roughly the size of a basketball held at arm's length, which sounds small until you realize you are looking at a world, a real, full, ancient world, 3,474 kilometers in diameter, pocked with craters, some of which are wider than entire countries, lit by the harsh, unfiltered light of the sun with no atmosphere to soften it. Stark, white and gray and black, utterly still, profoundly, overwhelmingly real. Victor Glover's words. Victor Glover, pilot of Artemis II and the first African American to travel to the moon, spoke about the experience with a quiet intensity that resonated around the world. He talked about looking at the lunar surface and thinking about all the people who had looked up at that same moon from Earth. People who had been told for generations that the sky was not for them, that exploration was not for them, that the future was not for them. He flew anyway. He looked down at the moon and he thought of them. His presence on that mission was not just a personal achievement or even a national one. It was a signal sent across history that the universe belongs to everyone willing to reach for it. Christina Koch's record. Before Artemis II, Christina Koch already held the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman, 328 consecutive days aboard the International Space Station during 2019 and 2020. She had floated in microgravity for nearly a year. She had watched 5,248 sunrises from orbit. She had participated in the first all-female spacewalk in history. And then, years later, she strapped herself into a different spacecraft, pointed at a different destination, and became the first woman in human history to travel to the vicinity of the moon. 2 records, 2 firsts, one extraordinary human being who simply kept saying yes to the next challenge, and the next, and the next. Jeremy Hansen's journey. Jeremy Hansen was selected as a Canadian astronaut in 2009. For years he trained. He worked as a Capcom, the voice of mission control, communicating with crews aboard the International Space Station. He participated in underwater missions, simulating spacewalks. He trained in caves in Italy to simulate isolated exploration environments. He spent years preparing for a spaceflight that might never come. And then it came. Not just any spaceflight, but the moon. He became the first Canadian to leave Earth orbit, the first non-American to travel to the moon, and the symbol of what international partnership in space exploration truly means. Canada contributed the robotic arms. Canada helped build the station. And now Canada flew to the moon. Reed Wiseman's leadership commander. Reed Wiseman led the Artemis II crew with the calm, methodical precision that the mission demanded. Before Artemis, he had spent 165 days aboard the International Space Station, conducting over 300 scientific experiments and setting a station record of 82 hours of research in a single week. He had served as chief of the astronaut office. He understood spacecraft systems, crew dynamics, and the particular mental discipline required to remain focused and effective when everything around you is extraordinary. In the weeks after the mission, he spoke about the experience of commanding the first crewed mission to the moon in over 50 years, the weight of it, the privilege of it, and the quiet certainty that what Artemis II accomplished was only the beginning of something much larger. The laser communication test. Hidden within the technical objectives of Artemis II was a test that could reshape the future of deep space communication. For the first time on a crewed mission, NASA tested laser communication technology, using infrared light instead of traditional radio waves to transmit data. The principle is elegant. Infrared light has a much shorter wavelength than radio waves, which means it can carry far more data in each transmission. Where radio waves might transmit at a certain rate, laser communication can potentially be orders of magnitude faster. For future missions to the Moon, and eventually Mars, this technology could mean the difference between sending a few photographs and streaming live high-definition video from another world entirely. The parachute system. When Orion re-entered Earth's atmosphere on April 10, 2026, it was traveling at roughly 40,000 kilometers per hour, faster than a speeding bullet, faster than almost anything humans have ever built. And it needed to slow down to about 30 kilometers per hour before hitting the water. The solution was a carefully choreographed sequence of parachutes. First, at 25,000 feet, 2 drogue parachutes, each 23 feet across, deployed, slowing the capsule to 307 miles per hour. Then, at 9,500 feet, 3 pilot parachutes pulled out the 3 enormous main parachutes, each 116 feet in diameter. Together, these 3 massive canopies slowed Orion from 130 miles per hour all the way down to 17 miles per hour at splashdown. Engineering, precision, silk and nylon and mathematics against the pull of gravity. Re-entry heat. As Orion plunged back into Earth's atmosphere, the friction between the spacecraft and the air molecules created temperatures around the heat shield of approximately 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly half the temperature of the surface of the Sun. At those temperatures, the air itself becomes plasma, a superheated, electrically charged gas that glows with an eerie light visible from the ground below. This plasma also blocks radio signals, cutting off communication between the crew and mission control for several minutes during the most violent part of re-entry. The people on the ground simply had to wait, watching their telemetry screens go blank, trusting the heat shield, trusting the engineers who built it, trusting the physics that said it would work. It did. The heat shield. The heat shield protecting the Orion crew module during re-entry is the largest ever flown on a spacecraft designed to carry humans. It is made of a material called avcoat, an ablative compound that works by slowly burning away, carrying the heat with it rather than transferring it to the capsule beneath. As the outer surface ablates, it creates a protective layer of gas that further insulates the structure. The result is that while the outer surface reaches plasma temperatures, the interior of the capsule remains at a survivable temperature for the crew. It is a technology with deep roots. Versions of ablative heat shields were used on Apollo capsules 50 years ago. The physics has not changed. The execution, however, has been refined to a remarkable degree of precision. Splashdown in the Pacific. At 5:07 in the afternoon Pacific time, on April 10, 2026, the Orion capsule hit the water off the coast of San Diego, California. 9 days, 1 hour, and 46 minutes after launch. The capsule could have landed upright, on its side, or upside down. All configurations were planned for. 5 orange airbags inflated automatically around the top of the capsule, righting it to an upright position in the water so the crew could safely exit. U.S. Navy recovery teams were waiting nearby. Within 2 hours, all 4 astronauts were aboard the recovery ship, tired, disoriented from gravity after days in weightlessness, and carrying with them the experience of having traveled farther from Earth than any human being in over half a century. 3,800 suppliers across 49 states. The Artemis II mission was not built by a handful of people in a single facility. It was built by more than 3,800 suppliers spread across 49 of the 50 U.S. states, an almost incomprehensible network of factories, workshops, laboratories, and engineering firms, each contributing some piece of the enormous puzzle. A company in one state manufactured bolts. A company in another state produced specialized electronics. Universities contributed research. Small businesses contributed components. Large aerospace corporations contributed entire rocket stages. Every one of these contributions had to be perfect. Every tolerance had to be met. Every test had to pass. And when the rocket rose from the pad and the mission succeeded, every one of those 3,800 suppliers shared in something historic. 10 European countries. The European service module that powered and sustained the Orion spacecraft was not built by a single country. Workers and suppliers from 10 European nations contributed to its construction. Germany, Italy, Switzerland, France, Belgium, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Spain, and the Netherlands. Components were designed and manufactured across the continent, then shipped to the Airbus facility in Bremen, Germany, where the module was assembled. It was then transported to NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida, integrated with the American-built Crew module, and launched to the Moon. In a very real sense, Artemis II was not an American mission. It was a human mission, assembled from the best work of a dozen nations, united by the oldest impulse our species has, the desire to explore. The countdown began 49 hours before launch. The countdown for Artemis II did not begin hours before launch. It began 49 hours and 50 minutes before the rocket left the ground. In those nearly 2 days, an enormous team of engineers and technicians worked through a precisely choreographed sequence of hundreds of tasks. Fueling systems were prepared. Batteries were charged. Computers were activated. The rocket was checked and rechecked at every level. The crew went through their own preparation. Medical checks, suit fittings, briefings. Weather was monitored continuously. And built into the countdown were deliberate pauses. Hold periods where the clock intentionally stopped, giving teams extra time to complete tasks or address issues without pressure. Every second of those 49 hours was planned. Nothing was left to chance. The weather rules. One of the least glamorous, but most critical aspects of launching a crewed mission to the Moon is the weather. NASA's launch weather criteria for Artemis II ran to dozens of specific rules covering temperature, wind speed, lightning probability, cloud formations, precipitation, and even solar activity. The rocket could not launch if lightning had been observed within 10 nautical miles of the flight path within the previous 30 minutes. It could not launch through certain types of cloud formations that could accumulate electrical charge. It could not launch if solar activity was severe enough to threaten the rocket's electronics. Every rule existed because someone, at some point in the history of spaceflight, had learned the hard way what happens when you ignore the sky. Radiation in deep space. Beyond Earth's protective magnetic field, space is filled with radiation. High-energy particles streaming from the sun and from distant cosmic sources across the galaxy. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station are partially shielded by Earth's magnetosphere. Astronauts on Artemis II were not. One of the mission's key objectives was to test radiation protection procedures and gather data on exactly how much radiation the crew was exposed to during the journey. The 4 DLR radiation sensors aboard Orion, developed by German scientists, measured particle flux continuously throughout the mission. This data will directly inform the design of radiation shielding and protection protocols for future lunar surface missions, and eventually for the multi-year journey to Mars. The life support systems. For nearly 10 days, the Orion spacecraft was the only thing standing between 4 human beings and the vacuum of space. The life support systems that scrubbed carbon dioxide from the air, recycled water, maintained cabin temperature, and provided breathable oxygen had to function without interruption. One of the explicit objectives of the Artemis II mission was to evaluate these systems in the actual deep space environment, conditions that cannot be fully replicated in any laboratory on Earth. The data gathered during the mission will be used to certify Orion's life support capability for longer missions, including the lunar surface stays planned for Artemis III and beyond, where astronauts will spend days living and working on another world. Emergency procedures tested even on a mission that went smoothly. The crew of Artemis II spent time practicing emergency procedures, running through scenarios for what to do if systems failed, if communication was lost, if the spacecraft needed to be abandoned. These were not theoretical exercises. They were real drills, conducted in the actual spacecraft, in the actual environment of deep space, testing whether the crew could execute emergency protocols quickly and correctly under the cognitive and physical stress of spaceflight. One of the 5 primary mission objectives was specifically to demonstrate emergency system capabilities, including abort operations and rescue procedures. In exploration, the difference between survival and catastrophe is often measured in seconds of preparation. CubeSats deployed. 5 minutes after Orion separated from the upper stage, a series of small satellites called CubeSats were deployed into space, released at 1-minute intervals. These tiny spacecraft, some no larger than a shoebox, carried a variety of scientific instruments designed to conduct experiments in the deep space environment. CubeSats represent a revolution in space science. Small, relatively inexpensive, and capable of doing real science in environments previously accessible only to large, costly missions. The Artemis II launch provided a rare opportunity to deploy these satellites directly into a high-energy trajectory, giving them access to regions of space that would be difficult to reach any other way. Each one was a small investment in a larger future. What happens to the upper stage after completing its work? Boosting Orion into the high Earth orbit that began the mission, the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, the rocket's upper stage, performed one final task. It fired its engine one last time in a disposal burn, directing itself toward a controlled re-entry over the Pacific Ocean, where it burned up harmlessly in the atmosphere. Nothing was left to become space debris. This attention to orbital cleanliness is not just good housekeeping. It is an increasingly critical practice as the number of objects in Earth orbit grows. Every mission that leaves something behind adds to a growing problem. Every mission that cleans up after itself is a small step toward a more sustainable future in space. The Orion name. The spacecraft that carried 4 humans to the moon is named Orion. Specifically, the Orion capsule for Artemis II was named Integrity. Each Orion crew module receives an individual name chosen by NASA, continuing a tradition dating back to the Apollo program, when capsules were given names like Columbia, Eagle, and Odyssey. The name Integrity was chosen with intention. It speaks to the engineering integrity of the spacecraft and the systems that had to work perfectly. It speaks to the personal integrity of the crew and the thousands of people who supported them. And perhaps it speaks to something larger, the integrity of the commitment humanity made and then abandoned and is now making again, to explore beyond our world, honestly, carefully, and with full understanding of the risks. The Zero Gravity Indicator. Aboard every crewed NASA spacecraft, there is a small, soft object called a zero gravity indicator, a stuffed toy or small plush item that floats freely in the cabin once the spacecraft reaches weightlessness, providing a visual confirmation that the crew has left Earth's gravity behind. For Artemis II, the zero gravity indicator was a small stuffed animal named Rise, chosen as a tribute to the iconic Earthrise photograph taken by the crew of Apollo 8 in 1968. That image, Earth rising above the lunar horizon, a fragile blue marble in the black void, became one of the most influential photographs ever taken, changing how humanity saw itself. Rise floated in the Orion cabin as the crew traveled to the moon, a small, soft thread connecting two generations of lunar explorers, separated by more than half a century. The long road to launch. Artemis II did not arrive at the launch pad quickly. The Artemis program was born from decades of planning, false starts, canceled programs, budget battles, and engineering challenges that would have stopped a less determined organization. The original Space Shuttle program ended in 2011. Various successor programs were proposed and canceled. The SLS rocket faced years of delays and cost overruns. The Orion spacecraft required the development of entirely new technologies. And yet, through all of it, thousands of engineers, scientists, and managers kept working, kept believing, kept solving the next problem and the next. The launch on April 1st, 2026 was not just a moment. It was the culmination of 15 years of stubborn, determined, unglamorous work. What Artemis III will do. Artemis II was a test flight, magnificent, historic, and essential, but not a landing. The moon landing that Artemis II made possible will come with Artemis III, currently planned for 2028. That mission will land astronauts on the moon's south polar region, a place no human has ever stood, where permanently shadowed craters are believed to contain ice water that could be a resource for future long-duration missions. The first woman and the first person of color are expected to set foot on the lunar surface. They will spend approximately a week there, conducting science, testing equipment, and laying the groundwork for something that once seemed impossible: a permanent human presence beyond Earth. The Gateway Station. Beyond Artemis III, NASA and its international partners are planning to build Gateway, a small space station in lunar orbit that will serve as a staging point for future moon missions and eventually as a waypoint for missions to Mars. Gateway will be international, with modules contributed by NASA, ESA, JAXA, and other agencies. It will be the farthest from Earth that humans have ever maintained a permanent presence, and it will be made possible, in part, by everything learned during Artemis II. Every system test, every data point, every lesson written in the performance of 4 humans traveling around the moon and coming home safely. The road to Mars. Every mission in the Artemis program is, in a sense, a practice run for something even more ambitious: the first human mission to Mars. The technologies being tested on Artemis II, the life support systems, the deep space communication, the radiation protection, the re-entry systems, are all technologies that will eventually carry human beings on a journey of hundreds of millions of kilometers, lasting 2 to 3 years, to another planet entirely. The moon is close. Mars is almost incomprehensibly far. But every hard problem solved on the journey to the moon is one less hard problem standing between us and the red planet. Artemis II was a step, a small, extraordinary, history-making step on a very long road. Why it matters. In the end, why does any of this matter? Why spend the money, take the risk, accept the years of delay and difficulty and uncertainty? The answer is different for different people. For some, it is science, the knowledge we gain about the moon, about deep space, about the biology of human beings in extreme environments. For some, it is economics, the technologies developed for space exploration that find their way into medicine, materials science, and computing. For some, it is inspiration, the children watching the launch who will grow up to become engineers, scientists, explorers. And for some, it is something harder to quantify, the simple, profound human need to go further, to see what is beyond the next horizon, to not accept the limits of the world we were born into. Artemis II flew to the moon because we are, at our best, a species that reaches. And when we reach, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, we touch something extraordinary. And that brings us to the end of tonight's journey. 50 facts, one mission, and a universe that is still out there, waiting. If you made it this far, whether your eyes are closed or still open, I hope something in these stories gave you a sense of what is possible, what humans are capable of when we decide that the horizon is not a limit, but an invitation. The moon is still up there right now. The same moon the Artemis II crew looked down upon from 252,000 miles away. The same moon that has watched every civilization rise and fall on this small blue planet below it. It has not changed. But we have. We are going back. And this time, we are not leaving. If you enjoyed this video, there is more waiting for you here on this channel. Every week we travel somewhere new, somewhere strange and beautiful and true. All you have to do is close your eyes and listen. Sleep well, fellow explorer. The cosmos will still be here when you wake up, and so will we.